Hello everyone, welcome back to the NPC Dungeon. Today, as promised, it's mysteries. Mysteries can be tough because you're intentionally making something for your players to do that isn't completely straightforward. You don't typically know exactly what your players are going to do anyway, but the whole point of a mystery is that you don't know at all because you're making something for them to figure out. And on top of that, you have to make sure the mystery is consistent, that it has a solution, and that your players have to be able to actually figure it out. In other words, that the mystery isn't unsolvable. One thing this means is that there's not just one super specific solution or a super specific set of things your players have to do to get there, because chances are if you make one answer, one solution, your players never come across it. And that might sound kind of tough, but do it a couple of times and it'll become second nature. Plus, I think this is just an important skill to have as a DM. After all, if you can herd your players through a mystery, you can herd them anywhere. But if you want more on learning how running a mystery is related to DMing in general, check out my videos on running open-ended encounters and prepping for a session to get a general flavor of how these things are connected. I don't mention it specifically in those, but like I said, it gets across a good flavor of it, I think. I do mention it specifically in my video on prison breaks if you want to know about how planning for a mystery is related to planning for a prison break. But for now, this intro dragged on for quite long enough as it is, so let's begin with starting your mystery. How do you plan one? How do you keep it consistent? Let's learn something. Well, let's start with an idea. Since mysteries by definition give your players a lot of different directions to go in and are just so multifaceted with all the different types of clues and suspects and such they may stumble upon, as we will see in more detail in a bit, it's important to have a solid idea in mind ahead of time. In short, what type of mystery are you running? And I don't mean you have to get super specific with the type of mystery, like is it a locked room mystery or whatever. You don't need to. You can if you want. I see no problem with it. But what I mean is a type of thing your players are trying to figure out. What is it? Is it a murder, a theft, a kidnapping? Once you know that, then start working out the details. Remember, this is D&D, so you're working with real people in real time, and these people probably aren't trained detectives, so try to keep it somewhat simple, the crime that is. You see, a good mystery doesn't need some complex plot to show some level of difficulty. Mysteries are complex only because your players don't have all the information. Most mysteries get solved after the fact of the crime, so the reason why it appears complex is because your players only end up seeing the aftermath, the results, meaning that some hints are going to end up being obscured, and it's up to your players to figure the rest out. One analogy that I like is that it's like trying to figure out what a puzzle looks like when you only have a fraction of the pieces. First, you have to figure out how the ones you have fit together, and then you have to try to extrapolate to fill in the rest of the gaps with your mind. That might sound like a lot, and indeed, I might have to go back and watch part of this video again myself, and I'm the one who said it. So, to make all this a little bit clear, let's look at a very brief example, and I'll be pulling from this example later on in this episode as well, and I hope that'll make it more immediately clear how you can turn a very simple crime into a very complex mystery. Well, let's say you want to run a murder mystery, so there's your idea. The murder. And let's say obviously one NPC is going to kill another. Now we can start gathering together those details that I said before that'll eventually become clues and start giving us clues. So let's ask why. Why did the NPC kill the other? Well, maybe the victim witnessed the murderer doing something they didn't want anybody else to see. Maybe the murderer tried to steal something in the past, like some priceless artifact or something. The future murderer noticed this, had them followed, hunted them down, and killed them in their home where they knew they live alone. How'd they do it? That's the second question we can ask. Maybe an arrow shot through a window from a distant rooftop. That sounds reasonable enough to me. Put more simply, person sees someone stealing, the thief knows this, has them followed, finds out where they live, hunts them down, shoots an arrow at them through a window. It's pretty simple, right? Obviously, this is a very watered down example for our purposes. If you want me to create this mystery in full, let me know in the comments and I'll make an entire mystery in a future episode and walk you through how I'd run it. But for now, what would your players see when they are summoned to the scene of the crime to assist in investigation? In other words, how would this look complex to them? Well, they see the victim lying dead on the floor in their own house next to an open window with an arrow in their chest. They may also notice the house looks completely untouched, meaning there was no robbery, no struggle, nothing like that. Now it's time to look for clues. Rather, for you, it's time to place the clues. But first, before we move on to clues, let me make a little point right quick. What I'm using right now is a very basic template. You can add to it as you see fit, so you may want to have your killer be clever and have accomplices go in and make it look like a robbery or something, maybe remove the arrow or close the window. If you do, I want to say, it's very important that you add more clues to compensate for that. Remember, the more things the villain does, the more clues he'll leave behind, and a more difficult mystery needs more clues. In the first case, if the accomplices come in after the murder, the players might find the time of death was before the lock on the door was broke, and they can also compare that with reports from the neighborhood about a break-in or something, if you want to put that in your campaign. You may also say that overturned items made to look like a robbery might have landed in the victim's blood rather than the other way around, showing that the break-in occurred after the murder, and the window might have been jammed or something, so when the perpetrator closed it, the frame might have broken. And you can ask, why would the victim break their own window? That, coupled with the wound left on the victim, might match the arrow, and it would be pretty obvious they were shot with an arrow from a distance through a window. But that's just a few examples of things you can do to add on to this. For one more side note on top of this side note, I realized that if the accomplices are going down there anyway, they could just hide the body, and you could definitely go that route. I'm just trying to keep this relatively simple for instructional purposes. Plus, this is D&D. You don't have to be hyper-realistic or anything like that. Give your players a few chances to solve, but don't make it too difficult on them. Also, the victim might even know someone's after them. They might have written a note in their last minutes, assuming they didn't die immediately. Maybe it's partially done, and part of the thief's name is written on it, so when the players narrow down to a few suspects, this can come in handy. And there's so many other ways you can go with this, but I'm already getting ahead of myself. I just inadvertently kind of introduced you to the idea of clues, but there's still so much more to be said. First, what kinds of clues do you leave? How many clues do you leave? How do you keep them from being too obvious? I'll leave the question of making them too obscure for later. And lastly, where do you start? Well, all of this can be solved by reframing the question. Instead of thinking of it as you making clues and placing clues, like I admittedly said earlier, think of it as you naturally pulling out of what would be left over after the crime. And then the kinds of clues, how many clues, and what they should be will be completely obvious. You don't need to insert a random note or a journal entry that just randomly exists and maybe has the word arrow on it or something. Another bonus of pulling clues naturally out of the crime like this is that it also makes it a little more realistic, as opposed to a random note or journal or something. You don't need any of that. Okay, that's cool and all, but what does this actually look like? I already showed you a little bit. In the bare bones initial version of the example I gave in which the criminal didn't have their accomplices go into the home of the victim, the fact that the house is untouched would be a clue. The criminal obviously wasn't looking for anything. The arrow and the open window would also count as clues, and the player may even look at the trajectory of the arrow to see where it was shot from. Again, they might do that. Don't try to depend on your players doing that. In the second version of the example, where the accomplices did help, position of the overturned items relative to the blood, the lock on the door, and the condition of the window, and even the neighbor's reports, if you decide to do that, would also count as clues. And speaking of the neighbor's reports, there should obviously be more clues than just those found at the crime scene. Think about what other locations, paths, people, and clues would fall out of this crime. Now it's time to start generating clues. Remember, this victim saw a crime. Maybe they didn't quite realize they were being followed when the criminal had them tailed, that is, but they had this strange feeling. They might tell a friend about it. They might also try to report what they saw to the guards, and whether the guards believe them or not is completely up to you. After interviewing their friend, the players may realize the victim witnessed something. They might, like I said, go to the local guard, and from there, they could even learn what these thieves were after and what happened, because I'm sure the guards knew something about that. They might look at what the guards know about these thieves and go to the initial scene of the crime, this initial theft, see what happened, see what was stolen, and see who did it. And now all that's left for them to do is to find them. And a trip to the location the arrow was shot from might provide just the clue or clues your players need to learn where the suspects are right now. Just a quick example of how I might do this. Maybe your players learn at the scene of the theft that the criminals intended to transport what they stole out of the town. Maybe they examine the tracks left behind by some wagon or the sheer amount of stuff that was stolen, and you can even connect it with something else happening in your campaign and say the players know of somebody who lives elsewhere who wants exactly what was stolen, but how the location of the arrow that was shot from leading to the criminal's current hideout. Well, maybe there's a thick mud left behind at the rooftop where the arrow was shot from, perhaps a mud consistent with the only port in town. Well, now you found your criminals. Or maybe they aren't even leaving town. Maybe the person they're stealing it from is in town, and the players may track down that connection when they begin investigating the theft. Of course, I'm not going to go into the specific detail of every single example that I give, so I won't with this. If I did look at every single example like that I'm giving in this episode, I'd be here all day. As I said, mysteries are very multifaceted. But hold on, didn't I just say earlier not to do this? Didn't I say not to make some direct path your players have to go down to figure out the solution to the mystery? I did, but that's not what I've just done. What I did is I just brainstormed a couple of different locations and clues, and I just used one possible path your players might go down to help us do this. So let's take stock of what we did figure out. We have the friend who tells your players that the victim felt like they're being followed. We have the guard who tell the players about the report the victim made after they witnessed the crime they witnessed. We have the location the arrow was shot from with the mud left behind, and the scene of the initial crime. And this is our next step. Take all of your clues and put them together in a big list. Know what leads where and where they learn what. As I said before, I know that this example is kind of vague, but again, it's only an example, and if you like, you can take it as one of the challenges I like to give on this channel and try to fill in the other clues and locations with twists of your own. One that you can do is come up with the way your players learn the stolen items are being transported out of the town. I give the solution of the players knowing somebody who wants what was stolen who lives elsewhere, but there are many other ways you can go. And you might even go completely off the rails and say the items aren't even being transported out of the city, and that the players learn where they're at in some other way. If you do, be sure to let me know what you come up with in the comments. I'm curious to see what you have. But what about the problem that I just posed a moment ago? Didn't I just make a routine that your players have to go down to solve the mystery? Not at all. Your players can go to and learn about all of the locations and people and clues and whatever that are named in whatever order they choose to do so in. They may go to the friend first, or they may go to the guard and only the friend later, then making the connection that the thieves are in fact connected with the murder. Alternatively, they can go to the rooftop first and find the mud that leads to the port. Of course, they won't know where the criminals are hiding yet since they haven't been able to connect them to the actual scene of the crime yet, so they still have to go to the other locations as well. But this does pose another problem for us, and it's precisely why I mentioned it in the way that I did. What if they learn about the mud, go to the port, and there's nothing there? It may seem like we painted ourselves into a corner, but these kinds of things are inevitable. They happen, and that's why you think ahead. You don't want your players to go to the port and then, like I said, nothing happen. So what I like to do is simply have whatever else I need to happen also happen there. Maybe this is where the friend lives, and if you have this planned out and figured out before the events of the campaign, before you run this mystery, you will already have things placed in locations so that this won't happen. This is another reason, like I said, why we gather all of our clues together, so we know what happens where, and so we can place things in different locations so we don't hold our own mystery up. But even with that fix, the last example where players go to the rooftop first still points out a major issue with mysteries. How can we keep our mysteries from being too obscure? Well, the first and most obvious thing that I'm going to mention is going to tie right back to that rooftop example. When your players go somewhere you don't expect, or where you have nothing planned, find a way to put other clues you had in mind there. This is exactly what we did a moment ago. I'll also tell a story in the next episode where I had to do just that. And when you think about it, this is really no different than what I usually say about improv with your DM toolbox that I'm always mentioning. In short, what I usually say is, the more you plan for, the more resources you'll have to pull from when your players do the unexpected. For more on this, feel free to check out my episodes on how I structure encounters and how I deal with player randomness. But for more mystery specific tips, try to make multiple clues at each place and multiple ways to learn about each of the other clues in each of the other places. You may not have to use them all, but it certainly gives your players more chances to figure it out, and it gives you more resources to pull from when your players investigate something you didn't expect them to. Maybe the rooftop isn't just where they'll find mud, maybe it's also a meeting place for the criminals in question. What things might your players hope to find there? What about the scene of the original theft? Another thing you might want to think about are what the other people might tell them. What might the friend tell them? What might the guard tell them? And how will you lead the players there? How will the players get to those locations and to those people? You might have a very active player who naturally starts asking questions like, did the victim have any friends? If not, you could always just have other guards at the scene of the crime who are also investigating just tell them. The guards could always say something like, well, we should have listened, and then to the players that the victim reported the theft that they witnessed. And lastly, you can get across a lot with just simple descriptions. For example, if you do what I mentioned way in the beginning and have the accomplices close the window, you could just say that it looks like the frame is broken, but that doesn't tell a whole lot, nor does it really let the player make the connections as easily. It's not very fair. It might be better to say something like, as you look out the window, something about the frame catches your eye. The frame looks like it's been split open at the side, but the wood is made from is old and warped, so the fracture must have been from a sudden impact. The victim must have known their frame was in such disrepair, but why would they move to close it in such a way if it was in such a state already? Perhaps it was closed by someone else. Try to be leading in this way with your clues. Kind of point the way a little and direct your player's eyes when necessary. For example, let's say that your player wanted to look for stolen objects, but there were none. You could just say there aren't any, leaving it at that, or you could say that they don't find any, but as they're looking, the window catches their eye, and then describe that, because you already had that clue in mind. In this way, you can sneak in some of your more obscure details without needing your players to think of everything. It's also a really good tool to use to keep your players from getting too stumped and to keep your mysteries from becoming too obscure to solve. And that's where I'm ending it this week. I hope you followed along pretty well, and I hope that you found this video helpful. If you want to learn more about mysteries, just let me know in the comments and I'll make more videos on this topic. As you might have guessed, I can talk about mysteries forever. Also, be sure to check out this week's story. It's all about mystery that I more recently ran. I know, I promised an old one, but when I started thinking about it, my memory was kind of fuzzy, but I just recently ran a kind of mystery, and I think it demonstrates a lot of these principles quite nicely, so I'm telling that one instead. Also, be sure to check back next week where I'll talk about session 0s for DM advice on Friday, as that is when I release my DM advice episodes on Fridays, and for a very special story, the first in a series I've been meaning to tell for a while and really looking forward to. This particular story follows how I introduced one specific character in the beginning of this campaign, and as always, it will be released on Saturday, which is when I release my D&D story episodes, Saturdays. Of course, thanks for watching, and until next time, let's learn something.